My husband texted, "Come home, we have wonderful news." 20 minutes later, he dropped a DNA report beside the cheesecake I had bought and said our daughter was not his. I want you to understand something about me first. I'm 43 years old. I run logistics for the Kentucky National Guard out of an office in Lexington. And if you've ever worked around soldiers, you know they don't care much for surprises. Neither do I. My whole professional life is built on knowing exactly where things are and exactly what's coming next. So when Michael texted me that Friday afternoon, I let myself believe, just for 20 minutes, that I was allowed to be surprised in a good way. He'd been up for a senior position at the construction company for weeks. I figured that was it. I stopped at the Kroger on Richmond Road on my way home and bought his favorite, strawberry New York cheesecake, the kind with the glaze on top he always picks out with his finger before I can cut it properly. Sophie was fussy in her car seat, pulling at the collar of my uniform shirt the second I got her out, and I remember thinking, this is going to be a good night. We don't get many of those lately, not since she came along at 42 after 4 years of appointments and needles and waiting rooms that smelled like hand sanitizer and disappointment. I noticed the cars before I noticed anything else was wrong. My parents' Buick, Michael's mother's Lexus, parked crooked like she'd been in a hurry. Kevin's Ford pickup taking up half the driveway. I thought, well, he's really doing this upright. Surprise dinner. Maybe cake for the cake. I actually smiled walking up the steps with Sophie on my hip, and that box balanced against my forearm. The house felt wrong the second I opened the door. Nobody was holding a drink. The television was off, which never happens at Linda's gatherings. She likes noise. She likes the room full. My mother didn't get up to hug me. She just looked at me the way you look at someone standing at the edge of something, like she was waiting to see if I'd fall. Michael was sitting at the far end of the coffee table with a manila folder in front of him, squared up perfectly with the edge, like he'd practiced setting it down that way. I stood there holding the cheesecake because nobody took it from me. "Rachel," he said, quiet, almost gentle. "Sit down. We need to handle this like adults." He actually offered me a tissue before he'd said a single word about what was wrong. That's the part I keep coming back to. The tissue, like he'd rehearsed the kindness of it. Then he slid the folder across the table, and inside was a DNA report saying he was excluded as Sophie's biological father. I laughed. I actually laughed because the idea was so far removed from anything real that my body didn't know what else to do with it. We tried for 4 years, Michael. You know what that room at the fertility clinic looked like better than some of the rooms in our own house. I started to say that, started to bring up the treatment records, and he just said, flat, like he'd already decided the facts didn't matter. The laboratory doesn't care about our history. Linda said I'd used him to pay for another man's child. My mother asked if there was something I needed to confess, like I was 17 again, and she'd found something in my purse. My father said nothing at all, and out of everything that happened in that room, his silence is what I still feel in my chest sometimes, late at night. I looked right at him and said, "Dad, are you really waiting for me to explain this?" He looked at the carpet instead of at me. That's when I understood this wasn't Michael losing his mind over a piece of paper. He had a separation agreement ready, a statement saying I'd left voluntarily, a clause letting the house go up for sale during the split. He said if I signed now, we could keep it private, like he was doing me a favor. I told him the house was my grandmother's, that it was in my name alone, and he said, "Easy as anything. We can argue about ownership later." I did not sign. Linda pointed at the door and told me to take that child and go before things got ugly. I was still holding the cheesecake. At 6:31, the front door opened and Thomas Bennett walked in with an old leather portfolio under his arm, the estate attorney who'd handled my grandmother's affairs for 30 years. I'd scheduled that appointment 3 weeks earlier, after I caught Michael photographing the deed to my house, my retirement statements, Sophie's trust papers. I hadn't told him I was meeting Thomas. I didn't want to accuse my own husband of something I couldn't prove. Michael assumed Thomas was there to help wrap up the separation nice and clean. Thomas looked around the room at the folder, the tissue box, my mother's face, my father's silence, and said, "Mrs. Carter, I can see this is a bad time, but given what's sitting on that table, I believe I've arrived at exactly the right one. He lifted the report without quite touching it, like it might be evidence, and looked straight at my husband. "Who collected your sample?" he asked. "And who collected the child's?" For the first time all night, Michael didn't have an answer ready. Thomas didn't announce that the test was fake. That's not how he operates, and honestly, that's not how anything real works either. He asked questions instead, the kind of quiet, specific questions that make a confident man start sweating. Which laboratory issued it? Was anyone checking identification at collection? Who swabbed Sophie? Because she's 13 months old, she can't exactly sit still in a waiting room and consent to anything. Where was the paperwork? Was there an original report anywhere? Or only this one printed copy sitting on my coffee table next to a cheesecake nobody had touched? Michael said he'd used a private home testing kit, one of those mail-order things. Thomas nodded like that was useful information, which I now understand it was. A private kit can tell someone things for their own knowledge, he said. It doesn't establish anything in a legal proceeding on its own. Before this family tears a marriage apart over it, I'd want the laboratory and the collection process verified. Then he turned to me and told me not to sign a single thing that night, told Michael in the same even tone that a woman doesn't get ordered out of a house that has her name on the deed. I could have stayed. Legally, I had every right to stay. But Sophie was crying. My mother was staring at her own hands, and the room had turned into something I didn't want my daughter breathing in anymore. Thomas wasn't telling me to leave because Michael had the authority to make me. He was telling me to leave for my own sake, and there's a difference, even if in the moment it didn't feel like one. I packed the diaper bag. 2 changes of clothes, her medicine, the stuffed rabbit she can't sleep without, my laptop, my badge. The cheesecake stayed on the table, still in its plastic Kroger clamshell, sitting there next to the folder like some kind of joke nobody wanted to laugh at. As I walked out, Michael said, "Leaving is going to look like an admission." "No," I told him. "Leaving means my daughter doesn't have to sleep in a room full of people calling her a mistake." I checked into a Hampton Inn off Newtown Pike. The room smelled like bleach over old coffee, the kind of smell you stop noticing after 10 minutes, but that clings to your clothes anyway. Sophie wouldn't settle in the pack-and-play, so she slept curled against my chest most of the night, and I lay there staring at a water stain on the ceiling shaped a little like Kentucky. Running through every fertility appointment, every shot I gave myself in the bathroom mirror, every embryo transfer, trying to find a crack where a mistake could have slipped through. There wasn't one. I knew there wasn't one. But grief and fear don't care what you know. I called my mother, hoping, stupidly I think now, that she'd apologize. "I want to believe you," she said, "but Michael showed us scientific proof." I hung up before she could hear me start crying. Here's the thing that actually scared me that night, more than any of it. It wasn't that Michael might believe the report. It was the growing cold feeling that he never believed it at all, that he'd planned every second of that evening, down to the tissue box. The next morning, over gas station coffee in the hotel lobby, Thomas explained why he'd really been coming to the house that night. 3 weeks earlier, he said, was when I'd caught Michael photographing the deed to your grandmother's house, your thrift savings plan statement, the trust you'd set up for Sophie, probate records I didn't even know he had access to. He'd told me he was updating our insurance. I hadn't believed him, not fully. So I'd called Thomas, who'd known my grandmother for 3 decades and understood exactly what that property meant. We'd planned to check for any liens, move the original documents somewhere secure, review Sophie's trust, pull a current record on the house. His arrival that night wasn't luck. It was a meeting I'd scheduled out of quiet suspicion, weeks before I had any idea what Michael was actually planning. Thomas called the laboratory listed on the report that same morning. The company turned out to be real, which knocked the wind out of me for a second. I'd been hoping it was some invented name, something obviously fake. But the case number printed at the top didn't match their formatting at all. and their customer service department had no record of any test under Michael's name or Sophie's initials. Thomas still wouldn't say the word fraud. He wanted it in writing first. That's who he is, careful to the point of frustrating, but I came to be grateful for it later. My father showed up at the hotel that afternoon with a bag of groceries, diapers, and an envelope of cash I refused to take. "I didn't know what to think last night," he said. "You didn't have to know what was true," I told him. "You only had to know your daughter well enough not to let them throw her out alone." He didn't have an answer for that. He left the groceries on the bed and walked out, and I sat there a long time after the door clicked shut, not sure if I felt better or worse for having said it. That afternoon, Thomas called again. I could hear it in his voice before he even got the sentence out. Something had shifted. "They never issued that report, Rachel." A pause. "And I checked the county property records this morning. Someone recently tried to open a credit line against your house." The credit application hadn't gone through, thank God, because the house was mine alone, inherited free and clear, and Michael simply didn't have the legal standing to pledge it by himself. But the attempt was real, and it was built on copies of the very documents I'd caught him photographing 3 weeks earlier. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a plan with a paper trail. Thomas brought in people I hadn't expected to need. A divorce attorney who specialized in financial disclosure, a forensic accountant named Megan Torres, sharp and unhurried, the kind of person who reads a bank statement the way most people read a grocery list, a licensed investigator to verify documents. I remember sitting in Thomas's office looking at the retainer figure for my new attorney and feeling my stomach drop. Several $1,000s just to start. I pulled it from the savings I'd been building for Sophie's daycare. I didn't have a choice, and I hated that I didn't have a choice. It took weeks, not days, for the full picture to come together. Megan doesn't work in dramatic reveals. She works in spreadsheets and patience. What she found was this. Michael had run up somewhere around $245,000 in liabilities, sports betting losses that stretched back over 2 years, cash advances on cards I didn't know existed, a personal loan, money borrowed against his truck, and transfers, unauthorized ones, tied to an expense account at the construction company where he worked. His employer, it turned out, had already opened an internal review before any of this happened at my house. He knew a normal divorce would drag every bit of that into the light. Bank statements don't lie the way people do. So he needed something faster, something that would make me want to sign quickly and quietly rather than fight. A private settlement where the house got sold. He walked away with a lump sum, and I somehow inherited responsibility for debt I never touched and never authorized. Both sides would waive any deeper look into the finances. Clean, fast, done. The DNA report wasn't meant to hold up anywhere near a courtroom. It only had to work on me for about a week before I had time to think clearly. He knew who I was. Private, proud. Someone who spends her working life around soldiers and doesn't like her business floating around break rooms. He was betting that fighting back would mean gossip breaching my office, that my parents already doubting me would tip the scale, that signing fast would feel easier than defending myself in public. He wasn't wrong about the fear. He was wrong about me. The piece that changed everything for me came from Megan, about 6 weeks in. She found a life insurance form Michael had updated that same year, listing Sophie Carter as his daughter. No qualifiers, no hesitation. A daycare enrollment form where he'd signed as her biological father. And then, days before the whole ambush at our house, an email to his brother Kevin. Once she believes the report can embarrass her at work, she'll settle before anyone checks the numbers. It wasn't a full confession, but it didn't need to be. It told me everything I needed to know about what that night in our living room had actually been. He hadn't paddied me for 15 years and used what he learned. Those weeks were hard in ways that don't photograph well, if that makes sense. No single dramatic moment, just erosion. Michael froze the joint checking account, so my attorney had to file for temporary orders just to get grocery money released. I missed 2 days of work for meetings I couldn't explain to my supervisor without unraveling. Sophie got an ear infection and screamed through 3 nights in a row at the hotel. The bill kept climbing. My mother kept texting things like, Just consider what's best for everyone. As if what was best for everyone didn't include me. There was a night, I'll admit this, where I almost took a smaller settlement just to make it stop. I told Thomas, I can earn more money. I can buy another house someday. I don't know if I can keep waking up like this. He looked at me for a long moment and said, He's not offering you peace, Rachel. He's offering you silence and charging you for it. I didn't sign anything that week, but I came closer than I like admitting. Then Megan called with something new. I asked her almost offhand whether Michael's employer knew yet about the transfers. Not yet, she said, but Michael knows their auditors are coming Monday morning. He had days left before whatever he was hiding stopped being his secret. My attorney filed for temporary orders that week. Nothing dramatic, just the practical scaffolding you need to keep a person from selling the ground out from under you while a divorce plays out. No major asset transfers. Restored access to funds I needed to buy diapers and gas. Preservation of financial records. A parenting schedule spelled out and documented so nothing could be argued about later that hadn't been written down first. Michael treated it like an act of war. He started telling people I'd brought in military lawyers to intimidate him, which was almost funny, since Thomas was a soft-spoken 70-year-old estate attorney who'd never worn a uniform in his life. Michael needed a story where he was the one being ambushed, and he told it to anyone who'd listen. I never got some clean, dramatic recording of him admitting everything. Real life doesn't usually hand you that. What I got instead was Michael getting careless in ordinary text messages, the way people do when they're under pressure and start believing their own version of events. You can make all of this disappear by signing what I gave you. Later that same week. The report already convinced your parents. A judge won't be harder. Kevin, to his credit, started asking his own questions once he realized what he'd actually helped set up. He texted Michael, You said this was just to get her to cooperate. You never said the paperwork wasn't legitimate. Even Linda reached out to me directly, uncertain for the first time. Michael told us the test was ordered by a doctor. Is that not true? None of those messages alone proved much. Together, they drew a picture nobody could argue with. The hardest part of those months had nothing to do with lawyers or spreadsheets. Under the temporary schedule, Michael got supervised visits with Sophie, and she'd see him and light up and say Dada, like nothing in the world had happened. I'd have to turn away and busy myself with something, her shoes, her bag, anything, because I hated what he'd done, and I couldn't hate the fact that she loved him anyway. There were nights I genuinely wondered if fighting this out in the open would end up hurting her more than it hurt him. My attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Laura, who didn't waste words, put it plainly one afternoon. Protecting Sophie doesn't mean protecting Michael from what he did with her. I needed to hear that more than once, if I'm honest. There was one moment in the middle of all that misery that actually made me laugh. The first real laugh in what felt like a month. Megan sent me a screenshot from Facebook Marketplace. Michael had listed his Rolex, the one I'd bought him for his 45th birthday, the one he wore mowing the lawn like it was a Timex. Excellent condition, worn twice. A buyer had asked if he still had the original box. His reply, My wife took it during the separation. I hadn't touched that watch. I sat in the hotel room laughing until my eyes stopped being dry from crying. Not because any of it was funny, but because Michael had reached the point where even his own carelessness had become my fault in his mind. Then I glanced up and caught Sophie's reflection in the dark laptop screen, and the laugh went out of me just as fast as it came. Around that same time, his employer put him on administrative leave after the internal review turned up the irregular reimbursements Megan had already flagged. Michael called me and said, unbelievably, that it was my fault, that my legal requests had created suspicion. Financial records created suspicion, I told him. I only asked to see them. He offered a revised settlement not long after, dressed up to look softer than the first one, but still asking me to sell the house, still asking me to hand him a lump sum, still asking me to share debt I'd never authorized, and to waive any further digging into his finances. He clearly thought the legal bills and the exhaustion had worn me down enough to take it. Laura and I talked it over and decided not to show every card before mediation. It felt like a risk. If our evidence turned out weaker than we believed, we'd be signing up for months more of this. But something told me Michael needed to believe right up until the last second that he still had the upper hand. At the mediation table, he slid the new agreement across to me and set a silver pen down on top of it, calm as anything. "Sign it, Rachel. We can tell everyone we both made mistakes." I looked at the pen for a second, then I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin folder of my own. "Before I sign anything," I said, "I think your attorney should see what your laboratory actually said about that DNA report." Mediation rooms aren't dramatic places usually. Beige walls, a long table, a mediator with a legal pad, and a tired but patient face. Just me, Laura, Michael, his attorney, and the mediator herself. Thomas and Megan stayed reachable by phone, but this wasn't their moment to run the show. And to their credit, they didn't try to. Laura laid it out piece by piece, no theatrics, just documents sliding across the table one after another, written confirmation from the laboratory that they had never issued Michael's report. Records of the attempted credit line against my house, statements showing debt he'd never disclosed, the string of messages tying the DNA accusation directly to pressure for a fast settlement, early findings from his own employer's review of those transfers. Michael tried to say someone else must have altered the report. His attorney didn't even look up from the papers, just asked quietly to speak with his client alone for a few minutes. I want to be honest about what happened next because it wasn't cinematic. His attorney didn't storm out or throw his hands up. He came back into the room and simply said mediation couldn't move forward until Michael produced complete financial records and gave an actual explanation for the disputed document. That was it. Professional, restrained, and somehow more damning than any outburst could have been. I didn't walk away from that room with everything. The unfair settlement got pulled off the table, yes. The orders protecting our assets stayed in place. A full financial examination got scheduled. Michael's credibility in that room, and probably in his own attorney's eyes, took a hit it wasn't coming back from easily. And a real DNA test, done properly through an accredited process, got ordered. It confirmed what I already knew. Michael was Sophie's father. It didn't surprise me, but seeing it typed out on an official form still made me cry in the parking lot afterward, sitting in my car with the engine off. Not relief exactly, more like anger. Anger that the truth about my own daughter had needed a piece of paper to be believed at all. Linda asked for a family meeting not long after. She wanted the same people who'd sat in that living room back in October to hear the truth in the same room where the lie had happened. I didn't want to go through another staged scene, but my parents had been there that first night, and so had Michael's, and something in me needed it closed the same way it had opened. This time, I didn't walk in carrying a cheesecake waiting to be handed permission to speak. I set a small folder on the coffee table and went through it plainly. The first report had never come from the lab it claimed to. The real test confirmed Michael was her father. He'd tried to borrow against a house that was never his to borrow against. He'd hidden a debt that would have swallowed us both, and his own messages showed he'd expected the accusation to scare me into signing before anyone looked too closely at the numbers. Kevin admitted he'd helped Michael gather everyone that night, but insisted he'd believed the test was real. Linda turned to her son with an expression I'd never seen on her before. "You let me call that baby a stranger in her own home." Michael tried to defend himself. "I needed Rachel to cooperate. She controls everything." "You didn't need cooperation," I told him. "You needed me too ashamed to ask questions." Then he said the thing that finally undid whatever was left of his story. The test wasn't supposed to go to court. It was supposed to make you reasonable. Nobody said anything for a long moment after that. My father stood up, buttoned his coat, and looked at his son the way you look at someone you don't fully recognize anymore. You turned your daughter into a bargaining chip. I don't know who taught you that, but it wasn't me." Then he walked out, and Linda didn't stop him. My father spoke next, quieter than I'd ever heard him. I waited for proof before I stood beside my own daughter. "I was wrong." I believed him. I told him so. But I also told him I wasn't ready to pretend that night hadn't changed something between us, because it had, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of lie. Linda reached over, lifted the framed family photo off the side table, the one with Michael smiling in the middle of all of us, and set it face down. I didn't smile. I didn't deliver some line I'd been saving up for months. I just picked up Sophie, said goodbye to my parents, and walked out into the driveway where the October ambush had started all those months before. For the first time since that Friday with the cheesecake, I didn't need a single person left in that house to decide whether I was telling the truth. 10 months is a strange amount of time. Long enough to change almost everything about your daily life. Short enough that you still catch yourself flinching at the sound of a text message coming in on a Friday evening. Michael's consequences didn't arrive all at once the way you might picture in a movie. They came the way real consequences usually do. Slow, procedural, unglamorous. He lost his position at the construction company once the internal review wrapped up. His professional license went into a disciplinary process that, last I heard, was still grinding along. He reached a civil settlement over the attempted credit line against my house, and he's now legally responsible for the debts that trace back to him instead of me. He enrolled in a structured program for the gambling, which I only know about because it comes up in the paperwork around his supervised time with Sophie. No handcuffs, no headline, just a man slowly losing the version of his life he'd built on borrowed money and other people's trust. I kept the house for a while. It was mine to keep, inherited clean, never his to touch, no matter what he'd tried. Michael moved out under the settlement, and for a few months I told myself Sophie and I would just go on living there, that the house hadn't done anything wrong. But every time I walked into that living room, I saw the coffee table. I saw the folder squared up too neatly at the edge. I saw my father staring at the carpet. A house can hold too much history to feel like rest anymore, even when it's legally completely yours. So I sold it. That wasn't Michael taking anything from me. By then there was nothing left for him to take. It was me deciding that owning something and feeling safe in it aren't always the same thing. I bought a smaller brick house in Georgetown. Narrow front porch, a fenced-in yard, a maple tree that drops leaves all over the kitchen window come October, which I've decided I don't mind. There's enough room for Sophie to grow up in without every hallway carrying a memory that isn't hers to carry. Michael completed 6 months of treatment before the court allowed supervised visits to resume. I don't rush forgiveness, and I told him as much. Our conversations stay narrow now. Pickup times, doctor's appointments, what Sophie needs. During one visit, he told me, almost pleading, I told myself I was protecting us from losing everything. You were protecting yourself from being found out, I said, and I meant it kindly, which surprised us both. He asked eventually if I thought I'd ever forgive him. That's not the work in front of us, I told him. The work is you becoming someone Sophie can actually trust. My father built her a little wooden playhouse in the new backyard, working on it most Saturdays for weeks. I stayed polite through most of that, friendly but careful, keeping a little distance. I wasn't ready to close yet. Then, one afternoon, he set down his hammer, looked at me and said, I keep wishing I'd stood up that night. So do I told him. That was the whole conversation. No big speech, no dramatic hug. But something in it started to soften after that, a little more each week, the way most real healing actually happens. Not in one moment, but in 100 small ones nobody else notices. This past Saturday, I sat on that new front porch with a glass of iced tea while Sophie chased soap bubbles across the grass, shrieking every time one popped near her hands. One drifted up onto the porch and burst quietly against my palm. And I sat there for a second, just watching the wet spot disappear into my skin. I used to think revenge would feel like watching Michael lose absolutely everything, watching him crumble in front of everyone who doubted me. But that's not what it turned out to be. Justice, in the end, looked a lot quieter than I expected. It looked like keeping my daughter safe, like refusing to sign something unfair just because I was tired, like letting the truth stay the truth, even when it cost me money and time, and for a while my relationship with my own parents. It looked like consequences landing on the person who actually earned them, instead of me carrying them for him. At 43, I learned that a lie doesn't get its power from being convincing. It gets its power from making you too ashamed, too frightened, or too exhausted to ask a single question. Michael expected me to disappear quietly that night. I did leave, but I never surrendered my name, my daughter, or the truth. If someone you trusted ever tried to rewrite your story, I'd love to know what helped you hold your ground. Share it in the comments if you're willing. Someone listening tonight might need the same reminder I did, that being exhausted doesn't mean you're defeated.